not to be featured. Anybody who does not want to be on the recording, you're welcome to keep your camera off or choose to stay on mute. There will be a chance for questions later, but it'll be up to you individually how that goes. So let me just say up front why we're here today. We are here today to listen to the ABP's Industry Insights team give us an overview of their recent report, which was titled Trust, Work and Organizational Systems, a look at how this is a shifting landscape. So by way of context for the Industry Insights team themselves, sorry, my computer does not want to go on the slides. Right. You'll hear today from three members of the Industry Insights team. That is Sarah Walsh, Daria Briggs, and then Nick Hayter. What they're going to cover is an introduction and overview of the report, which I'll do very, very briefly, and then they will take you through in detail their method and their findings in the sections which follow. Firstly, the team currently has 6 people in it, all of whom are volunteers and do this work on a voluntary basis for the ABP outside of their day jobs. Each bring a different perspective and approach to research and a different history and background professionally. So we've got a really broad base of thinkers who have helped us get to the point where we've now produced this 2026 report. In terms of an introduction, it's worth saying that the ABP created the Industry Insights intention, shall we say, in 2023. And at that point, we intended to distribute insights based on member surveys and broader industry surveys, which we would conduct to help us understand not just where the business psychology industry was coming from, but also where it was going to. We had, of course, already in 2013, for example, started collecting case studies of business psychology and practice through the awards program. And so we were able to very effectively track how the industry was moving in terms of practice. But we recognized that having an insight team actually start to speculate on the future would be of great value to our members as they planned their education and their development to future-proof their careers. So that really is where the current team kicked off from in 2025, saying, let's not limit ourselves to the insights that we can gain from the past, from the awards, from our own surveys and data, but let's expand that into a broader look at what the industry, or what we can find out about not just our industry, but those influencing it. And so it's with that in mind that they published the first report in June this year, which was shared at the conference. And so with that being the case, I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, who will start taking us through what happened next. Sarah, over to you.
Fab, thank you. So hopefully there's not too much background noise. I'm doing everything I can to cool down, but that does mean the doors are open and the fans are all on. So hopefully it's not too noisy. But if it does, put it in the chat, and I'll try my best to resolve that. But yeah, my name's Sarah Walsh. I'm an org development practitioner, and as Claudia said, part of the Industry Insights team. I've got a few slides to take you through before I hand over to Daria, who's going to take you through some of the exciting data that we found. As it says on this slide, we didn't set out to study trust. A lot of the findings, the report is about trust, but that wasn't our intention. We set out to explore the current landscape of business psychology and just to see what emerging themes were arising that might shape future practice that hopefully resonates with us all and we could learn from. And as we reviewed research, and that research was around workforce data, practitioner perspectives, organisational evidence, a pattern seemed to emerge again and again. Different sources were highlighting different challenges, whether that be burnout, leadership scepticism, concerns around fairness, psychological safety or lack thereof, employee engagement, and reactions to AI. But beneath these issues, we kept seeing the same underlying theme, and that was about trust. It kept coming up again and again. And then rather than being one issue among many, trust seemed to connect to a wide range of organisational challenges and opportunities, which then prompted us to look more closely at trust as a possible principle for understanding what is happening in today's workplaces. So this report is really the result of following that evidence rather than starting with a predetermined conclusion. And we have got some interactive bits at the end where, once we've presented our findings, we really want to hear from yourselves as to what resonated, what didn't, what are your experiences, just so that we can hear from practitioners and researchers like what you all think of what we found. So if I go into a bit more detail about the method, like I say, it was broadly evidence-based. So rather than relying on a single data set or a perspective, we looked at multiple different sources. So the first one was academic research, including organisational psychology, management literature. We all had a really fun Christmas. I certainly did, reading all these different papers. We're all massive geeks, which is probably why we're part of the industry insights team. The second source was industry and workforce data, so helping us understand what those larger scale patterns and trends were. And then the third was practice-based evidence. So what are the practitioner insights? Because it's one thing looking at management literature and then workforce data, but actually what are practitioners saying? What are the case studies saying? And what are the observations from our community of business psychologists and beyond? So in total, we reviewed more than 20 academic papers in theoretical works, over 40 workforce and industry reports, and more than 90 practitioner and professional insight sources. And what is important is that across all of those different data points, similar themes appeared again and again, even from those different evidence streams. So the conclusions in the report are triangulations of all of those different forms of evidence. So hopefully what we say does resonate. It's been a really robust process. So if I give you an overview of the findings, and by sharing this, we're hoping it gives you the story behind the findings, so that if you are finding that it is resonating, you've got some of the language and some of the evidence base to support what you might be seeing and might need to be saying to anyone in your organisations where actually they need to understand this themselves. So as I say, there were several recurring signals emerging. And as I've mentioned, it's skepticism towards leadership came out again and again, increased levels of burnout and fatigue, concerns about fairness, this sense that there's a decline in psychological safety appearing, lower engagement rates, and growing distrust around AI and AI-enabled systems. So, for example, what are they here for? Individually, I don't imagine any of these challenges are particularly surprising. I think they've been discussed for many years, but I think what was noticeable was how consistently they appeared together, almost as a system across the sources. And the report in no way suggests that trust is the sole cause of these issues, but rather it's a cross-cutting factor, a lens, you might say, that influences how employees experience organisational life. And we found that when trust is weakened, many of these challenges become more pronounced. When trust is strengthened, organisations are better able to navigate uncertainty, change, and complexity. And that there was a lot of context across our findings around we're operating in a world that is increasingly complex, increasingly uncertain. And so even within that, the challenges are becoming more pronounced. And we'll go through that when we talk about the data. So this is why trust emerged as a significant theme throughout the research. But one thing we just wanted to make really clear is we're by no means suggesting in the report that trust is disappearing. One of the most important conclusions from the report is that it's not disappearing altogether, but that there isn't a story of it being a continual decline. What we're saying and presenting, what the findings and evidence were suggesting, is that trust is becoming more fragile, more conditional, and more uneven. And if I just define those terms a little bit more, by fragile, we mean it can be lost quickly when employees experience inconsistency or unfairness. And once again, I think there's a context to that where there's more opportunities, I think, to experience that inconsistency, for example. By conditional, we mean people are increasingly basing their trust on what they directly experience rather than automatically extending it to organisations or leaders. And by uneven, we mean trust can vary considerably across teams, departments, and levels of the same organisation. So we can't treat trust as a generic blanket thing. it's very subjective and relationship based. So, for example, employees may trust their immediate manager, but then be more skeptical of senior leadership. They may trust some systems and processes, but not others. So the key point for us is that trust is increasingly earned through experience rather than assumed by default. And so on this next slide, one of the report's central findings is that the findings were suggesting that trust cannot simply be viewed as a cultural or engagement issue or something to be reflected on at the end of an intervention or almost as an afterthought. It's a system level condition that affects organizational performance. And many of the priorities organisations are grappling with today depend on trust to succeed. And actually, when we presented the report as part of the conference, I think it's really changed how I see the report. So much of the conference was about AI and making sure that we're guardians of the human connection. And I think that's really what we're speaking to here when we talk about trust. So if I use AI as an example, there's a difference between implementing a system and then adopting it. So AI adoption really requires that confidence that systems are fair, that they're accountable, that people know what they're here to do. Hybrid working is another example, depends on trust between employees and organisations. Wellbeing initiatives rely on employees believing that organisational intentions are genuine rather than just a fad. And organisational change becomes much harder when people are sceptical about leadership decisions. So as I've kind of alluded to, when trust is weak, organisations often experience resistance, disengagement, and that increased reliance on control mechanisms, which actually then reinforces the fragility of trust. When trust is strong, organisations are generally better able to adapt, innovate, and sustain change. So the report suggests that trust is not simply an outcome to measure. It's something that can be deliberately designed into systems, processes, and everyday experience. And I'm now going to hand over to Daria to talk us through some of the specific data.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daria Briggs. I'm a researcher in psychometrician, and in this project, I was responsible for the text analysis of employee voices. When we discovered how central trust was and how much it shifts, we became curious about what would it look like in real employee language, the way people actually speak about their work. Are there meaningful changes over time? We wanted something unfiltered, like unstructured experience, real perceptions, emotional responses, everyday working reality, not prompted by an employer. So we turned to Glassdoor. It's peer-to-peer. It spans hundreds of organizations, and that makes it ideal for picking up macro trends. So we took a sample of reviews from a wide range of English-speaking companies across 11 years, from 2016 to 2026. Would people talk about trust at all? Would they talk about it more positively or negatively? And would the picture look the same today as it did a decade ago? So to answer that, we defined next slide, please. Yeah, so to answer that, we defined what a high trust language looks like and what breakdown language looks like, and compared it to the real language of the reviews used in modern language processing techniques. And that allowed us to assign each review a kind of a trust score. And the positive score, it means the more language of trust in this review, and negative score is more language of distrust. So on this graph, you can see real quotes from Glassdoor data, but to give you a sense of the extremes, so a highly positive review might describe a manager who openly admitted a mistake and made it right with the client. And a highly negative one might describe leadership that changes priority hourly, with everyone chasing the latest obsession. So when we received for each review this trust score, what then we did, we aggregated those scores and get a meta score, the year score on trust. So, and there's this yellow score you see on the line. And so basically when the line goes up, then it means that the language of trust was dominating or prevailing this year. And when the line goes down, it means the opposite, basically, that more avoidance, breakdown, distrust throughout of what employees say about their companies and various companies during those years. Yeah, so what we see in this just one simple graph is quite striking. So around 2019, a sharp dip after 2019, and then it's like, and it's a reset, but it's never really a full recovery. So the crisis of that period showed up directly in how people wrote about their employees and how much trust they were manifested and what they wrote. So the major findings, I suppose. So what we did then, so to define a trust and what we mean when we say trust language, we used a validated psychometric framework, and we used a real inventory, behavioral trust inventory, which breaks trust in 2 dimensions. This says like trust is reliance and trust is disclosure. So reliance is roughly about, are you willing to depend on someone else, to someone else's competence, judgment, and follow through? And disclosure is, are you willing to share sensitive information, concerns, or mistakes with someone? And what they did, what inventory does, it measures not just reliance or disclosure in a vacuum, let's say. So it measures to certain reference to colleagues, managements, their institutions. So, and that mattered for us. We wanted to look in a bit of reach a bigger picture. So we couldn't just assume that trust behaves the same way across relationships. An employee might trust their colleagues completely but distrust the institution, or rely on their manager while worrying about how their data use and etc. So we used this reference, and what we also did, we extended and add a 4th referent, the technology. So we thought it was really important to add it because digital systems and AI, well, it's a hype topic, so we also wanted to jump in it a little bit. But it is and genuinely very central now in how employees experience their workplace. So we thought it should be an important piece of our research. So what then we did, we looked at this separately, at each referent and each dimension basically separately, to see if the movement and dynamics across the year would be different. What we saw that trust language does not fragment neatly by who it's directed at, and it moves together. One important thing to flag when reading this chart, each referent is a relative measure. We're comparing each dimension to its own baseline across years. So what we're looking at is the shape of the lines, not their position relative to each other. So what that means in practice. So before 2020, reviews were sounding more like trust language compared to other years across the board. And the drop happened everywhere. The shapes, though, even though we can compare them relatively to each other in terms of who is higher and who is lower, but the shapes do tell us something. So the fall in disclosure language towards colleagues was less dramatic than towards technology. But then recovery has also been slower and less complete. And the technology disclosure, by contrast, shows the steepest drop and the strongest rebound, and perhaps even like a little bit of spike of enthusiasm at the point roughly around the whole hype around AI and automation, when it just kind of appeared out of nowhere for most of the people. And then like at the end, like now it's shifting down a little bit as well. So that's the components of trust. So we didn't stop with the trust. If you go on the next slide, we wanted to see their different aspects. So we wanted to, we also tracked what we call the breakdown signals, like the language of burnout, disengagement, reduced psychological safety, low collaboration, and manager strain. And those signals were also moving with instead with trust. So this is maybe a bit difficult because it's a reverse. So when trust dips, as you see around the same to 2020, then this all kind of spikes, these languages, and then they also kind of recovered, dip a bit lower towards after 2023, but then again they never go back to pre-2019. We look at something more like look at additional workplace conditions like compensation fairness, job security. It's still that the previous slide. Sorry, it's there's two graphs together. Yeah, so they also work-life balance. They all show the same dip. There were slightly different recovery patterns. You can read the report if you're interested. We're probably not going to go in depth, and we didn't research in depth. It's something for you to think about. But in C compensation, it was kind of this shows the biggest divergence from the rest of the patterns, and it's actually the only thing we look at which kind of recovered to a pre-2019 level at 2025, which is interesting on its own. Is something to think about. We didn't go deep, and maybe someday we will, but I found this interesting. So yeah, go further. The next slide. So the previous analysis showed how trust language moved through years, but we were also curious about something different. Which of these signals would best explain how employees actually rate their employer overall? So what you see here on this picture as a predictive power of each measure individually, how much of the variation in overall rating each one explains on its own. So which one is the the kind of has the biggest input, I suppose, on the overall person's decisions to rate their company. And it's the top of the chart tells a clear story. Disclosure technology comes out strongest, followed closely by institutional measures, reliance, and disclosure to the organization itself. And what that means in practice, the single best signal of how someone feels about their employer is whether they feel they can be open with the company systems, whether they trust the systems enough to expose themselves, to share information, flag problems, be visible. For me, it's almost Orwellian when you think about it. And if you don't feel safe being open within organizational systems that colors everything else, maybe it's like almost a litmus test for the whole culture. So people trust and rate their employer well when they feel the organization itself is trustworthy, not just their manager, not just their colleagues, the system. And also, it's not there on the graph, you can read in the report. When we put all the measures together in the same model to predict overall rating, we see that trust in colleagues, it became even not significant, it's not contributing well enough in overall rating, which we interpreted like trust in colleagues cannot override and compensate for broken systems. And that corroborates what we saw elsewhere in the literature and what Sarah said about it being a design and system problem rather than individual problem. Couple of small things as well you can read in the report to follow. So we also done just a theme analysis. We looked and in general the all corpus of our employee voice data, how do they which topics emerge and which more popular topics. And when we look in the negative reviews, by big margin, the biggest topic was about toxic leadership and culture. And if you see the rise and fall in the relative proportion, and the relative proportion of these reviews, you can see that it's very close to the trust score as well. So it's kind of rise and recovers and deeps the same as our trust. So there's a lot of like shared language among everything and among what people say. So, and it's very logical. We can all imagine a review which says, like, I'm burned out, my work-life balance is wrong, and the system is constantly look at me. I cannot move without being scared that I'll be fired. And then suddenly they say that, oh, but I trust my company and I love it. Or something. So it doesn't work this way. So and we see it in data. A bit of a bonus question. So we looked separately just about AI mention and automation and just in general all the systems, how often people talk about them in the reviews. And you see on the top the circles, the dots, their size represents a proportion of it being mentioned and addressed in the whole set of reviews we had. And we see it's growing towards 2026. So at the beginning, like 10 years ago, people were barely mentioning it. And if they were mentioning it, they were mentioning it more in the positive light. They were saying, oh, it's a good company to work with. They're on cutting edge of data science, of automation. And after 2020, from 2020 as well, it's all getting more like it's even out in terms of how often do you see automation mentioned in positive or negative reviews, a bit going towards negative, and the mention of it keeps increasing. So it's also kind of get reflected in data. So to sum up, employee voice didn't tell a different story. We feel it's strengthened and validated the one we'd already seen elsewhere. And 5 key takeaways for us that trust rises and falls with burnout, safety, engagement, and security. Toxic leadership and consistently dominant negative theme and closely tracked trust decline over time. Good colleagues cannot compensate for broken systems. Trust to disclose to company systems acts as a litmus test for the whole culture. And AE moved from clear optimism to ambivalence and probably a bit to skepticism. And perhaps one additional takeaway, more technical, a methodological one. This kind of analysis itself is a powerful tool. It shows what is possible when you apply modern language processing to raw and unstructured data in scale. So it helps to get numerical trends extracted from the everyday words of hundreds of thousands of employees. So it's very good lens that organization could use to listen differently. So the more and more research around it and it's developing. So I would advise to pay attention to that as well. It's just another tool in your toolbox. That's it from me. I'm happy to give my way to Nick.
Yep. Thank you, Daria. So yeah, I'm Nick Hayter. I'm a business psychology practitioner. And we've just seen there from the great presentation of data from Daria that in employee language, trust fell sharply through the pandemic period. It's then stabilized, but not at its earlier level. So the next step, and the section that I'll take through in this presentation, is really to consider what this means inside organizations. And it's important because trust is not a soft cultural measure. It's going to impact whether people commit, speak up, accept changes, or rely on the decisions around them. So essentially, this matters because when trust weakens, everyday organizational activity might become harder or more effortful. So in terms of impact, in practice, organizations might not tell us that they have a trust problem, but I bet they can readily describe the symptoms. So new initiatives that are met with skepticism, people doing what's required, but maybe withholding a bit of commitment or that discretionary effort. They might become more cautious about speaking up, or those decisions, they're questioned rather than accepted. Now, I've done a lot of work in employee engagement, and sometimes those sorts of behaviours might be easily labelled as resistance or disengagement. But if we look at it through a trust lens, it can be a very natural response to uncertainty. People are less willing to make themselves vulnerable when they do not expect consistency, fairness, or follow through from their leaders or from their organisation. So in the cycle at the top of this slide is important as well, because how leaders might respond to uncertainty or that perceived lack of trust or those symptoms I've just described is that they might readily add approval stages for monitoring and control. Now, that could be reassuring for them in the short term, but it reduces autonomy and can signal to employees themselves that they're not, in fact, trusted. That can produce a further mistrust and then even more control, and you see it becomes a cycle. Important to stress, though, I'm not saying, or the reports aren't saying, that all controls are bad. Of course, that's not right. But it's when control might be used as a substitute for trust that it becomes self-reinforcing. So the organizational cost is that friction. Change slows, communication requires more persuasion, and leaders then spend more time overcoming that skepticism. Go on to the next slide. And then we're going to look at kind of applications. So if trust has become more fragile, more conditional, what can practitioners like us do about it? And the answer here is not simply more communication. Organizations need to create that consistent, fair, and transparent experiences that give employees good reasons to trust them. And we've called out 5 implications here. First, explain. So make it clear how and why decisions have been reached, particularly where AI or data is involved. Align, just reduce that gap between leadership messages and what employees encounter in practice. Simplify, just unnecessary complexity. It's going to increase ambiguity. People will struggle to trust they'll struggle to trust systems if they're not understanding them or can't navigate them. On design, build fairness, consistency, and accountability into the process itself, rather than just trying to repair trust afterwards. And something that Sarah said, and we heard this in the conference, trust is just that much easier to break than it is, in fact, over a long period to build. And so it's really important to kind of have what we've just said there of these 4 areas and making sure that people are experiencing that. But the 5th one's also important in terms of adapt. Organizations, you can't just remove uncertainty. They have to provide that consistent principles, but also face through allowing people to make decisions through the uncertainty that they face. We have mentioned AI a lot, but I think actually this sort of framework or these practices or these applications are really important to AI, as we keep mentioning, because it makes those decisions around AI, they're particularly visible at the moment. Technical accuracy isn't going to be sufficient. People are also going to want to know who remains accountable, how the decision was reached, and whether there's a meaningful route to question it with regards to the technology and how people are then working with that technology and what it means for their roles. So across all 5 areas, a practical test would be, well, can employees understand what will happen, why it will happen, and who is accountable, and what they can do if something appears unfair? If you go on to the next slide. So what we've also done is put this into a trust framework. So across the research, and as we mentioned, we didn't set out to find out or report on trust. It's just emerged repeatedly through those different sources and different organization contexts. So then when we connected those findings, it's not, as I mentioned, just communication or employee engagement or leadership in isolation that we were seeing. It's just the everyday experiences employees have of their organization. And we've summarized those themes into this trust framework. Now, it's not intended as a formal diagnostic or scoring tool to see whether trust is high or low or benchmark, but we feel it's a really helpful practical lens for just examining a policy or a process or a change program or technology in companies. So they're fairly understandable, but I'll just talk them through quickly in terms of transparent. Can people see how decisions are made? Apply that to everyday decisions in teams or to organizational decisions as to what people are experiencing. But that transparency is crucial. Reliable. Are similar situations handled consistently? So there's no point just being transparent and this is how we're going to do it on the one hand. And then if it's not reliably applied across the different parts of the organization or over time, that can erode trust. Are they understandable? So can people make sense of the system and its decisions? It does not mean they have to agree with every decision necessarily, but they should at least be able to understand it. Systematic is about whether trust is built into the normal day-to-day operations rather than depending on one particularly good leader or manager. Is it the way things are done around here? And tangible are organizational values or promises visible to those employees in what they actually experience. And we keep using that word about experience. And I think the first T and the second T kind of bookend this framework. Decisions need to be visible, and the resulting experience should match what the organization has promised. So ultimately, trust is shaped less by what organizations say and more by what people experience consistently. On the next slide. So here, trust as a design principle. This is where we as business psychologists or we as practitioners, we have the opportunity to move beyond measuring trust, but to help shape the conditions that produce and sustain high levels of trust. So the process across the top: listen, understand, design, and evaluate. It's important. Listening alone will weaken trust if you're not going to do something with that feedback. So I've worked in employee surveys for a lot of my career, and there's a lot around you said, we did. Now, I actually think just giving your views is cathartic, and employees are very willing to tell you about their everyday work experiences or completing that annual engagement survey or with continuous listening to give you their feedback. But they will far more readily give you the feedback if it's not just listening, but is a conversation. And so therefore that well-intentioned design just needs to be evaluated across what people are experiencing by saying, we heard you on this and we're actually doing something behind what we've listened on. So every area inside the center of then the slide, so where we can influence trust, that's a potential trust touch point. Recruitment and onboarding. Are the decisions consistent? Is the criteria clear? And is feedback handled constructively? During change, are people involved appropriately? Are they given a credible rationale and told what happened to their feedback? With technology and AI, do people understand how the systems affect them, who remains accountable, and how decisions can or will be challenged? And we don't need employees to just trust organizations or technology blindly, but it is important to make sure that we make trust warranted around those, so providing the sufficient evidence of fairness, reliability, and accountability. And that really is the opportunity I feel that we have as business psychologists, not just to measure trust after the event, but using something like these or the frameworks we provided on the few previous slides to really have that view of designing and evaluating the organizational conditions through which trust develops. Now, Sarah, you may want to just add in a couple of points on this slide, and/or we're just going to now move to kind of get some of the reactions and hopefully questions and thoughts from you as participants. Hand over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. So almost, I guess, as a prelude to some of the questions that we have, as a practitioner, I was kind of reading the research, and I read research quite frequently because I just enjoy doing it. And I'm always left with the question of, I totally agree with that as a concept, and I look at the practical implementations and I get it. But the reality of doing it in practice can be quite challenging. And so that's why the questions are around practice and how we can turn this into something practical, I guess. So if I give you an example there, and I can't remember the title now, but it's in the bibliography if you wanted to read it. One of the papers we did read, which was a really excellent one around AI implementation and why adoption isn't going as smoothly as many organizations would like. And trust was obviously an underpinning reason for that. And it got me thinking about my own situation in my own current organization where they're experiencing this, and then thinking about myself as a researcher and practitioner and thinking, I get all of this, but how do I do it almost? And I think the report does go into more detail about that sort of aspect, but I just wanted to draw it out a bit because obviously there's so many factors that can affect how we take this forward, whether it's people's mindset around trust. Do people see it? Do leaders, people in position of power, have a mindset that trust is just a given rather than earned? So I guess the only thing I wanted to add to this sort of point is that point around listening and understanding, and really understanding where your starting position is, mapping your system a bit, who will get it, who won't get it, where might you need to do some coaching to support understanding of trust. I think where I've worked, there has always been a mindset that trust is a soft thing that's nice to have, whereas the paper goes into a lot more detail about it's a strategic imperative without sounding too corporate. So hopefully what the report does, beyond just giving you those practical implications, is give you more around language that you can use to really demonstrate the value that looking at through a trust lens and using it as a design principle can add. But we're really keen to get feedback, get questions. So these are the questions that we have for you. And actually the first one is a little bit leading because it suggests that the findings did resonate with you. We're very open if they're not resonating as well, in all seriousness. But yeah, the questions that we have, and we'll do them one by one just so that we can make sure we get to all of them. But the first one is just which finding did or didn't resonate most strongly with what you're seeing in your organisation or with your clients. Where do you see trust being built or unintentionally eroded? Because it's not like we're setting out to erode trust. It's happening unintentionally in a lot of spaces in everyday organisational systems or practices. Looking at the trust framework that we presented, which element do you think organisations should prioritise first and why? How do you think emerging technologies, particularly AI, will shape trust over the next few years? And then what's one practical action we can take to help organisations strengthen trust? So I'm just going to pause and hold the silence a bit and recommend that we focus maybe on that first question, what has resonated with you, what hasn't resonated. And you can speak up when watching for hands, or you can put it in the chat and we can read it out for you. I'm just going to hold the silence. Yep.
So this is from a slightly different angle because I'm not actually a practitioner. Coincidentally, this is my first ABP meeting. I just sort of wanted to see how it felt because I completed a master's during COVID. So the first question was more to do with the last role I had as a worker. And I really resonated with the part about trusting colleagues, not necessarily influencing as much, because the people who I worked with, I trusted so much. They were the best thing about working there. But actually that trust in leadership was really, really low. And that ended up being the cause of me leaving. So I just found it interesting seeing that replicated in your findings, having had that sort of lived experience of it.
Thanks for sharing, Chris. I mean, others can comment. I'm sorry to jump in, Sarah, but certainly in employee survey research, Chris, that comes through all the time as well. So how is your team getting on? How do we approach tasks? Do we have shared views, or how are we communicating and responding and getting work done? The survey data or survey benchmark scores for our team does this are always in the 80s and plus on many topics. You ask those same questions, but the frame of reference is department, scores go down a bit. You ask the same question, but the frame of reference is the organization as a whole or leadership, scores go well down into kind of 60% favorable on most topics. So your lived experience, I think, is really true. And resonates with both the data from this report, but also other organizational sources. The difficulty then is also how organizations kind of work with that, because it's very easy for managers, in fact, and I've worked with many individual line managers of teams of kind of 5 or 6 that might be 6 or 7 kind of hierarchy points down in their structure of the organization. And they find it hard, very hard, to get that balance right between being open and honest, telling the team, I've got you, I'm here for you, let's sort of keep that, the strength that we've got as a team, but how do we almost expand that out to the wider collaboration, and how do we all buy into what the organizational message is? Because it's quite easy for a frontline manager to side with their team and avoid the messages from leadership and not help leadership communicate some of those hard decisions, whether it be on AI or change and transformation and those things. And it's easier sometimes for the line manager to side with their team and not in fact carry the difficult messages to help their peers and their senior leaders. And I can see you nodding. So does that resonate with you as well? Because it can be that lived experience that you get on so well with your manager, and the difficulty for that frontline manager is to toe the right line between the communications that they're being told from their senior leaders.
Well, I was nodding so thoroughly because had that almost exact experience of I was that sort of middle senior management
Yeah.
who ended up siding with my team
Yeah.
because I had so little trust in the owner of the company, and it was so obtuse almost that
Yeah.
it would have almost made me look a fool to
Yeah.
agree, or at least that's how I felt. Obviously, it's completely
Yeah.
subjective if she was or not, but
Yeah.
I really
Well,
felt that.
thanks for sharing. And that's where it gets even more difficult, right? Where the line manager does have their own views or a topic that might even be of the side of the team leader. And then how do you go that through in terms of the communications, openness, trust they have with peers and senior leaders within the company? And Sarah, I jumped in. Was there anything else to add on that great question from Chris?
Yeah, just a different perspective, because my roles are often working across organisations, a bit like yourself, Nick. I don't know if my internet's very good, sorry, so apologies if I keep breaking up. But I think a lot of this is about vulnerability, and this is just my experience, if I think about the organisations I work with and how they've had to navigate such uncertainty, there is a big mindset around I need to have the answer, I need to do this, I need to do that, and there's not often a lot of vulnerability that I notice to then be able to be upfront about, as a leader, this is the challenge I'm having. So then they end up putting a bit of a veneer on, and that then is a break of trust without doing it intentionally. And I think there's loads of examples like that where, because that vulnerability isn't there, because those mechanisms for honesty aren't there, this is where I think trust is unintentionally eroded a lot of the time. And there is a different way, I think, to approaching it, but I think, and this is where I found the report so interesting, because we could have gone into so many different areas, but we had to focus it on what we were finding. But I do think a lot of it is linked to vulnerability and perceptions of leaders, perceptions of what people want during change, and it becomes complex really quickly. Fabulous, thank
We
you for
also
that.
had a comment from Rosemary about the comparison of this to the Gallup data. Rosemary, do you want to say a little more about that?
Yeah, I was just.
We did have Gallup in the content we were studying, but of course we didn't side with each of, we were kind of aggregating. So go ahead.
Yeah, it was just really interesting, I think, because there is a lot of data, isn't there, about the importance of relationships at work and happiness at work through colleagues, and that Gallup survey that always has that key question about do you have a best friend at work, which comes out as quite significant. So I was just curious. It's interesting, I think, and not surprising in a way that the context and the organizational systems has a more profound effect. So it was I was just reflecting on that, really.
Yeah, but I think the comment is it's important to understand that what we were predicting isn't just overall rating of the organization. So it's only an extension to say that the person who rates the organization low will quit this organization necessarily, or like it's just this particular, the perception of how well this organization is affected more by, well, systems essentially, so which is quite logical, but it doesn't, well, at least our data does not look into whether it predicts their performance, engagement, and whether the person will quit this company. So it's just only extension of the argument by proxy, but the data is mainly about your overall scoring of this company. So as simple as that.
Like to go ahead? Dr. Nicholson?
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, thanks for the presentation, guys. Yeah, my observation is around the timing. I mean, I think it's interesting that the steepest decline in trust came in the COVID period. And I think I find that quite interesting, because to me, that is the precise point at which leadership was challenged, because no one could run their own organizations because government was running everything. And I think, an indication with the benefit of hindsight is that government didn't actually do a great job, not just in this country, by the way, but in pretty much every country, of running everything. But leaders were effectively rendered helpless at that point in time. they couldn't show vulnerability because effectively any decision that they took, I mean, I was in Kent, 1 minute we were in lockdown, the next minute we were out of it, the next minute we were in it again. So I think for any leader who was leading at that time, they were frankly unable to lead. They were not leading. And I think that speaks to me about, I think, Sarah, you made the point about vulnerability. Leaders became vulnerable at that point, but precisely at that point, they could not show vulnerability because everyone was screaming for leadership and there was a leadership vacuum. So I think that there's, the trust piece is very interesting, but I think it cannot be separated from leadership and the challenge of leadership and the fact that trust in leadership has not attained those pre-COVID levels again. I think tells us everything that we need to know about where organizations really are struggling. And I think that struggle is being exacerbated by some of the language that we see today, which is quite polarized between leader, worker, manager. All these labels have become so rigid and so impermeable that I think that also has contributed to that failure, if you like, to reattain those sort of pre-COVID trust levels. So I think there's a big thing here around leadership and how leaders can lead without necessarily being command and control leaders, but lead in a way that is effective. But recognizing that, number one, this is a very complex environment. They don't always have the answers these days. What was the answer today is not the answer tomorrow. And number two, I think there's a taint here because, wider leadership, if you like, societal leadership is frankly in breakdown at this particular point. That's my observation.
Yeah, and when we saw the data first, Dawn, my take initially was COVID was a moment, well, any crisis is a moment where underlying fractures surface. So if there was going to be something tested, a crisis is going to be what tested. So that's why it was interesting to see the effect here, especially when you factor in that Daria looked at it from a system trust, from a colleague trust, from each of the different dimensions of trust across the 8 variables. And so in the organization I was in, I felt the leaders very accountable and found it disappointing. But I think that it kind of reminds us that the organizations don't always know their weaknesses until something critical strikes them. And that's why it's useful to have additional insights too. Sorry, but I'm also seeing, Karen, you had a comment there. Do you want to just tell us what you're thinking there? Karen, was that sort of an implication that the nature of communication changed? Okay, so Karen had made a comment in the chat, just for those in the recording, saying that she's looking at the fact that she wonders if the increase in remote working since COVID has made it difficult to build trusting relationships. People missing out on those informal water cooler conversations and having to rely more on formal communication. And that is the type of thing that can absolutely corrode trust. As Sarah's agreed. Kai, do you want to weigh in?
Sure, I was just following through with the layers of COVID's effect, much like what Dawn was saying. But from the perspective that as employees, we're less likely to offer the capacity for trust in that extent to our organizations. Organizations are no longer such a big part of our lives, largely due to what happened in COVID, where they shrank so much. And we're not affording that space for them, even if we did have that trust. That higher demand for a work-life balance to bring ourselves only in part to an organization and not commit to an organization as much as we may have done 10 years ago.
Yeah, thanks. Rosemary, it's interesting that you're saying that you see AI creating that additional insecurity where Daria did point out that system trust is a factor, but also that AI as such is slightly ascendant in its mention, but not significant. I mean, at 4%, even at its highest point, it's not huge. Daria, do you want to say more about that? Thematically, do you think you could support that AI is creating a sense of insecurity? as people
I think it's difficult to say from our data in particular, so that definitely what we can say for sure is we see that the people definitely start talking about it more, and we can say for sure that it start being talked more in a negative sense, and in more there's like more and more things about it's being like employee surveillance, and it's been more linked to lower trust. We didn't specifically check the link between like AI and job insecurity. So I think it's a valid argument to make that it is contributing a lot, but from our data, we cannot say it for sure because we didn't look at it specifically, if it makes sense. And and the link between trust and AI adoption is what Nick said, and it's just in a general sense. I feel with AI, when we talk about adoption, we also need to. So AI, when it comes to organization, is come from two ways. It's kind of, it has bottom up. So people are using it, they adopted it for their everyday use, they adopted it for their work in a way which companies even don't know. So there is, it's not even sometimes a question of adoption, because the adoption is skyrocketing, but this is unstructured adoption. And there is like AI systems and agents which a company's trying to impose, and how those two interact and how they talk to each other, and how this adoption goes, and where is the guardrails and the boundaries everyone is talking about. And it's kind of two-sided trust, that whether employees trust their employees to use it responsibly, AI, and whether the employees trust employers that those AI is imposed on them is responsible. And it's almost like a battle of to AI's implementation. So it's a totally, from organizational perspective, I think it's unprecedented case, which everyone is trying to figure it out. And yeah, the trust must take a hit.
Also looking at the glossary of the report on that with the source reports that we use, because there were several that were focused on AI adoption. And it's interesting, the other experience that people are having is insecurity in what they can make decisions around when they're responsible for a decision a machine actually made, or when they're having to trust a machine, but should they? And then they're being held accountable when the machine makes a decision. So actually that kind of thing is also underpinning some of the mistrust. People who are perhaps expected to work with systems that they don't know whether or not they can trust. But Nick, I'm wondering if you want to comment to Alison's comment, because if I'm understanding it correctly, you're kind of looking at the fact that sometimes, Alison, people do things reactively after they've had a survey. There's communication, and sometimes people don't actually notice then the impact, because potentially it's just info overload, just another update. But I think that kind of maybe, Nick, speaks to what you've talked about, is how this has to be a lived experience. This can't be a circular where we tell people things they should trust, right?
Sure. Alison, did you want to just add to what Clodagh summarised there?
Yeah, so it wasn't quite that. So you know, people react to a survey saying that they don't trust that things have been done.
Yep.
In the meantime, they might have been done before the survey, or they might have been and they just haven't noticed, or they might have been done afterwards in response to that survey, and it's being communicated. But there's so much communication overload, not just at work, but you go home, you got emails, you've got AI, you've got TV, whatever, and there's so much information, and it's also thrown at you. So I think people have, there is an element, which is what I've noticed amongst my colleagues, in that they don't go out and look for information anymore, because they expect it to all be just sent to them. So that just kind of, it was something that I've been working on, that I thought of that different dimension as I was typing it.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think trust in organizational surveys and trust as a theme, where you might say, I trust the decisions of leaders, or I feel that leaders are communicating in open and transparent ways, those sorts of things, they absolutely tie in to whether engagement is up or down, which also ties into the reciprocal effect about the organisational performance that year and how things are being done. What I mean there is where business performance might have had a rebound or a positive impact off the back of, say, COVID, because there were some lean years or difficult years during that. Alison, I think it's a great point. If you ask employees, is there trust in the organisation, or do you trust in leaders? And leaders have just communicated great information about business performance. They've paid out bonuses, or they've done what they can to show that the future of the company is on a really good trajectory. I think people also then give benefit of the doubt on trust or on those other topics or issues, or say we are being listened to, we are having a positive impact in previous surveys because it's leading to this and this as an impact. But the reverse is also true, which is really difficult for leaders. They may put in a lot of effort to do follow-up off the back of a prior listening event. But if during that year they have had, as leaders, to communicate things that are just really tough decisions about business performance is this, the advent of AI is that, or in the competitive landscape that we are operating in within our industry, it means this in terms of business performance. And so therefore we recognize that you guys have had to work really, really hard, but we're not paying out commission or bonuses to the level that you come to expect, or even worse, we are having to do restructure, i.e. redundancies. That message, you're absolutely going to take a hit on I trust in leaders, or leaders communicate well during that. And I think that's where benchmarks become, I don't rely too much on benchmarks in the work that I do, because they are external, and your own internal benchmark and trend, whether you're up or down, is more important. But I think that benchmark around whether engagement, trust, or these topics are more on the rise within your industry or within your geography, I think that does help leaders to interpret that, to say, actually, if you've had a level score year on year or a slight decline, even in things like I trust in leaders, when you understand the business context or the external context around that as well, Alison, I think it's a great point. So I do think you ride the crest of a wave on positive, but equally they can come down through, I'm not saying through no fault of their own, but they come down through that context. So, sorry, Alison, did you want to come back?
The actual question is, do you think the survey feedback leads to action?
Yeah.
But it's the same.
Oh, exactly. I think I've seen that go up, I've seen that go down, but I think I do see that tied into whether you trust or not in leaders, which ties into what some of the communications and openness has been. So I think you get a positive impact on, are we doing things off the back of the prior survey, through doing things off the back of the prior survey, of course, but also you get that if communications from leaders that year has been far more positive, because it's a more positive story, to if it's negative. And also what we wanted I'm speaking like generically, of course, but employees often want quite big things fixed: workload, work pressures, reduce my stress and demands, but also pay me more and commit to me to say I'm going to have lots of opportunity for growth and development and a new job in the future. That's a lot to expect sometimes, that you do need to also, as an organization, pick and choose the things that are realistic to be influenced over the next 1 year. But yeah, I can completely agree with your point, Alison.
I think just to add to that, that was part of the comment I made as well about followership. I sometimes, if I'm honest, feel a bit uncomfortable talking about leadership, because I wonder if it kind of points to what you're saying, Nick. We kind of have massive expectations, and as humans, we like certainty. And it is a great time of volatility. And I think there's something about there being a need for everyone across an organisation to develop their tolerance for that, rather than, I'm not discounting anything around the findings to do with toxic leadership. I just noticed a gap in the research around followership and relating that back to expectations as a variable. Are they actually just too high? And how does that contribute to these findings and patterns that we're seeing about trust? I feel quite passionately about that, but that might just be me.
I also I wanted to add something. I didn't just throw in a conversation. Mostly, I think what we didn't specifically look at, but probably an interesting things to look at, and maybe you can share your experience, is some generational shift. So as just generations change a bit, the expectations on like transparency and accountability getting higher. I can't reference what, I don't remember the source, but I remember that I read about charity work and just how charities operate, and they see just more and more from people who actually support them to just ask and share the data to make it transparent where their contribution goes, how the contribution was spent. So not just doing a good deed, but kind of demanding from the charity organizations to show what's being done and decided and everything. And that was like a generational shift. I'm wondering in the workplace as well, we see this conditional trust is partly as a newer generation just isn't as readily ready to do as they're told, kind of thing, and it just want more clarity and from the leadership and from organizations. And that's just I don't know, something we didn't explore specifically, but I think it's an interesting thing to look at, and I wonder what people think about it. If anything.
I tend to have a slightly skeptical view of the sort of intergenerational arguments that are being made, if I'm absolutely honest. I mean, I think that a lot of the sort of social identity type perspectives, for want of a different sort of phrase, I'm not convinced that they truly hold water. I mean, I've met many sort of skeptical 50-year-olds in organizations as well as skeptical 21-year-olds. So I suppose the question might be in how that level of skepticism is articulated. And some of that, could be what I would, I suppose, describe as, playing the game, whether you're playing how you're playing the game, whether you're playing the game, whether someone who's 50, has got an eye to a senior position and perhaps is going to keep their powder dry for another moment before they basically make the point or dispute the point or whatever, versus someone who's, 21, 22 or whatever, who might have either a lot to lose or nothing to lose, basically. So I think it's always been there, irrespective of sort of demographics, if I'm absolutely honest. That's my view.
I'm sorry. Hi, Kerry. I operate mainly in the Middle East space, actually, but I'm in the world of talent acquisition, fractional work stuff. And I think sometimes on that, Daria, I think it's a lot about, from my perspective, would be on expectation management. And I think that sometimes what I see with the younger generations coming into the workforce is they have an expectation of what it should be, and maybe that's not always being met. And sometimes if I think about the more tenured space, maybe their expectations are lower, and maybe they are like used to having trust broken, and see it as maybe sometimes like a system that you have to learn to operate in, maybe to Dawn's point of like those politics, which is if it is, if it was something like that, it is quite sad. I was also thinking as well about that change piece with all of this, because organizations are having to change direction and strategy so much more quickly now than they'd had to do pre-COVID. And so that, for me, that graph of like the drop and then not being able to get back up to that same trust level, I wonder if it is going to ever be possible, because we're just operating in such a different space now, that there isn't as much time always to give that visibility and to say, like, this is what we want to do, and we're going to do, because they have to change direction much faster than that. But I love this trust framework. And I think if I think about it from some of the aspects that I work with, that as much as you can make that decision making visible, and then really align that, for me, the transparency and the tangible, like aligning what you say with what you do. Because even with like the leaders that I work with, I think that's for them, that's the biggest lack of trust, is values statement versus what it actually feels like to work here. But it's such a simple framework, and you would think you can do these things. It's not impossible, but it was really, really interesting. So thank you all so much for your insights and research.
Are we going to close and ask for input, Sarah?
Yes, I think, Nick, are you covering this bit?
Yeah, I didn't know. So
All right.
yes, I am. I'm ready to go. I was primed. I was just confirming that we had finished on the
Very smooth.
Yeah, so thank you. I really enjoyed the questions, by the way. It's always the best bit, just talking to a screen or sort of sharing. I love the fact that we're able to share, and that's what these sessions are for, but they really come alive when we get the questions, reactions, how it's actually applied in what you're seeing. And so really for me to say, where does this leave us? So our conclusion is not that trust has disappeared or that every organization faces the same problem, but it is that trust does appear to have become more fragile, more conditional, and less likely to just be assumed. You can't take the great point made. You can't take that level of what was pre-pandemic and assume that trust would just get back to there now. There did happen through the onset of COVID, reactions to that, different ways of working. It seemed, or from this data, plummeted. It's reset, but not back to the level that it was. Employees increasingly kind of test what it is that organizations say versus what they actually experience, which is what we keep saying, that T and T, be transparent, but also kind of be that tangible in terms of what I'm experiencing through those decisions, systems, technology, and really just the everyday interactions. Take home point is that consistency helps to strengthen trust. Remember also that adage that you can break trust really easily by something which just fundamentally has said, well, I don't trust the leaders for this because I look at what they did then. They'll remember that one thing that broke trust far more, it will resonate with them for far longer than all of the day-to-day interactions that will build it. But the hard bit there, or the important bit there, is that consistency helps to strengthen trust. And gaps between words and experience, that can be the thing that does erode it. So for business psychologists, that's the challenge and the opportunity, right? I mean, we just said there, practitioners working in different spheres, different spaces, different regions of the world. But that, again, what I sort of love so much about the industry that we work in. But it's not something to simply measure in an employee survey. You can do that. There's some great questions, benchmark questions to ascertain employee perceptions around trust in organizations, trust in leaders, trust in your team. But it's really how we as practitioners help those organizations build into the way work is designed and experienced for employees. So if organizations want more trust, the focus should be less on asking people to trust us, but more on demonstrating that they are trustworthy. Next slide, because I think I've concluded. Anyone can come in. But then these ones, so we have gone through at the Great ABP conference earlier in the year, we had like a half-hour snippet session. We knew we had this one, which we've recorded, which is a longer session that went through much more of the insights, the findings, the data. But it's still actually really just an overview of the work done. There are 3 industry insights reports which will explain or explore the themes in a lot more depth. And that covers the research, the practitioner perspectives, the employee voice findings, and then also the implications for organizations. And so again, if you haven't already, we encourage you to download and explore these reports in full. And then finally from me, QR survey, let me set this right. We didn't go in, as we keep saying, to do a report on trust. And one of the things that we've learned the most through this project is that it's not one single data set or one single perspective that's going to tell the whole story about the current trends. So we have done a lot of desk research, data compilations, all the stuff that has been done already has enabled us to produce those 3 reports. But it needs to be ongoing, and that's why I would love your contribution. So if you feel that you want to, or you want to use that QR code, it's just a short survey, and it will help us because you get to just say what it is that you're seeing in organizations or with your clients. And really, the more perspectives that we as an industry insights team gather, the better we understand truly the challenges and opportunities that are facing our profession. So it will help with follow-up reports that we do, and we'll keep looking at the information that we gather from these sorts of surveys from you as practitioners to help future research and comments, or and topics that we might go and explore in the future as well. So really just a thank you from me and us, and then over to Clodagh and anyone else for any final remarks.
You know, the white paper that Dara did is like 40 plus pages. The main report, there's a lot of info, so please do feel free to dive a bit more deeply into that. But the survey is a great place to ask questions of the team, because we will continue to use the existing data and additional data gathered to find new and meaningful insights that are informing practice today and the future of the industry. And that's what the ABP wants to bring to you. Anybody listening to this recording that's not already a member of the ABP, please consider joining and supporting this initiative as well. Everybody is welcome. And I heard a voice.
Yeah, I was just trying to say that don't hesitate to reach out if you have any details, and to me for white paper, and with any technical questions or challenges, I'll happy to respond.
That's appropriate to say, because really it's only richer each time we add a new perspective to it. So anybody is welcome to get in touch with the Industry Insights team. If you just mail admin@theabp.org.uk, so the general mailbox, I'm happy to forward things directly to the individuals in the team. So that's Daria or Nick or Sarah or Simone or Karina. Otherwise, we can also handle them collectively. So do feel free to reach out. We want to keep this interactive.
And we always said, didn't we, that we would do maybe articles throughout the year, because we just knew there were going to be lots of offshoots. And I definitely feel very enthused / passionate about the point around expectations management, because I think that is key, the expectations as things have shifted. But there's so many offshoots we could look at, generational aspects, there's loads. So really, really excited to hear different perspectives and to take those forward if we can and keep the conversation alive.
Right now, we've also got Adrian Furnham working on an article based on these reports to support a submission to the European Bulletin. And we've also got Steve Carter publishing an article in the coming week or two based on his perspectives on the report and his time in practice improving cultures and trust in organizations. So hopefully what we're seeing here, it's not just about our team extending these insights, but actually hearing from you. So if you've got something that you think would meaningfully add, you are very welcome to also create an article for submission. Our submission guidelines are on our website. And again, if you want more info on that, just drop a note to admin@theabp.org.uk. This is one of those for the people, by the people associations. So truly, everybody's welcome. With that, I will close off the recording, and thank you again for being here.